Hey, this is Stuchiu, and for today's video, I wanted to talk about a way we can improve the CSGO tournament circuit. And the idea I have comes from Dota2. And generally, when you're uh, looking across Dota2 towards the Dota2 community from the CSGO perspective, the first thing everybody wants is the international. And reason is it's because it's such a huge spectacle. There's crowdfunding. It's such a massive event every year that you can't help but think, oh, wouldn't that be so sick for CSGO? But there are a lot of different reasons as to why I don't think it'll work and why I don't necessarily like it as much as the current CSGO major circuit. But that's its own topic. But what I actually want to go into is the DPC or the Dota2 Pro Circuit system that Valve tried to implement last year from 2017 to 2018. And I think that is actually the thing CSGO should steal from the Dota 2 esports system. And generally, the fact that it was used in Dota 2 would almost instantly invalidate it from being in usage in CSGO, because as far as I remember, the devs of CSGO specifically stated they don't want to do anything that copies Dota 2. But since it's no longer being used by Dota 2, it should now be a viable option. And another thing to note is that even though CSGO devs don't seem to want to copy anything Dota 2 does, the Dota 2 side doesn't seem to care. They just copy whatever seems to be working on the CSGO side if they want to. So let's talk a bit about the DPC. And there are actually two iterations of the DPC. There's the 2017 to 2018 and then the 2018 and 2019. For now, we're going to not talk about the 2018 to 2019 version because it's a completely different it's a different system from the 2017 and 2018, and for various reasons I'm not going to go into, it doesn't transition nearly as well as the 2017 to 2018 edition, in my opinion. Now, the 2017 to 2018 edition of the DPC is fairly straightforward. It's actually, as far as I can tell, in terms of cost, it's very little. Like, it's basically just a structural reform of the system we already have set in CSGO. And unlike Dota 2, there are a lot less initial problems. So let's go into it, at least on a Dota 2 perspective, and then how I would transition that into CSGO. So for Dota 2, here's how the DPC worked in 2017 to 2018. At the time, from 2016, we'll have to jump back a bit. From 2016 to 2017, Dota 2 was basically, I'd like to say, a wasteland for tournament organizers, because here's basically what happened. You had the big Valve majors, and then you had TI. And then because Valve didn't, as far as I know, Valve didn't really release the schedules, and Valve created unrealistic expectations for player treatment and all the money they put into the majors. Like, as far as I know, they were giving people like business class tickets, airplane tickets from all over the world, and that's just way too expensive for even the most well-established tournament organizers in the space right now. And there's apparently there's a bunch of other stuff I don't quite know about, but as far as I can tell, like, it was ridiculous. And so because of that, what happened from a TO's standpoint was Valve was putting up these ridiculously high prestige events that had high budgets and were unpredictable in the calendar year. So it was not impossible, but it was very hard to schedule a Dota 2 tournament in that year, in the Spectrum, especially because, well, TI is the only thing that kind of matters in Dota 2. It's not the only thing, but it's like the most important thing. And so everybody else kind of takes any tournament that isn't directly related to TI is kind of looked on as like a side event or like a side gig for all the Dota 2 teams involved. So because of that, it's already hard for TOs to incentivize that. They can't really schedule it, and even when they do schedule it, like, you might not even get all the best teams, and then they expect higher quality stuff and you're already losing out on the money. It's like, there's a lot of reasons as to why I don't think a lot of TOs have like picked up Dota 2 compared to CSGO at the time. And so and Valve decided to fix this by implementing the Dota 2 DPC system from 2017 to 2018. And basically what this idea was you don't run any more Valve majors. Instead, you allocate DPC points or Dota Pro circuit points to various tournament organizers. And these DPC points were given based off of various guidelines. So how many tournaments did you have? How many teams did you have in your tournament? The regional qualifiers you have, and the format you have. As far as I know, those are like the three major restrictions. There might have been others, but I didn't know exactly what they were. And so with those restrictions, you can apply for a Dota 2 like certificate, I guess would be the word. And then Valve would give you a license of you're either a major or a minor. Now, there are various reasons as to why this didn't quite work in Dota 2. First, because the gates were open, there was a ridiculous amount of I won't say it's oversaturation necessarily. I guess it depends on that term. But basically, there was a ridiculous amount of tournament organizers that came into the space during this time period and tried to open up their slots or take up the space that Valve left behind after they got rid of their own majors, right? And by doing that, basically, there wasn't good quality control, and the Dota 2 teams didn't really understand the concept of burnout. And I think the game itself isn't quite as good for that kind of system because of the way things were patched during that year, where I think it was at some point it was like every 2 weeks a new patch came in. And in Dota 2, like, patches are way more meta defining than, say, CSGO, even though I'd argue they're probably less meta defining than like League of Legends or Overwatch. But regardless, basically, with that kind of system, you had ridiculous amounts of travel, ridiculous amounts of burnout, and I don't think teams were experienced enough to understand that you could skip events. And I also think like the allocation of the points wasn't quite correct. I think the way the minors worked during that time period, I think they got a few too many points. So when you looked at like the major minor difference from that point, like, let me check the exact amounts to give a better example. So let's see here. Right, so for a major, they basically have like 1,500 points, and then for a minor, they give 300 points. But because of the split from a major to a minor, so you get like 150 points if you win a minor, and then let's see here, you'd get like 225 points for third or fourth in a major. And so basically, in that kind of system, it kind of incentivizes teams to go to the minors to pick up easier points, and that increases burnout. So like, I just don't think the major minor system quite worked out the way Valve envisioned it for Dota 2, because there were way more minors than majors, because it was way easier to get that qualification. I think. Oh, and I guess another point to add is the qualification was also accorded to prize money. So I think like you had to get $1 million in order. You also had to get like $1 million in order to qualify for a major slot. But go into that later. And so the problem with the Dota 2 major minor system is like teams were incentivized to go to all the events because the minors gave you easier DPC points, because getting first in a minor could be easier than getting top 4 in a major, just because of what teams were in attendance. And outside of, I'd say, Virtus Pro, none of the teams really exercised the option of skipping out on events. Like Secret didn't do it, Liquid didn't do it. I think who else was? Well, basically, I don't think Newbie did it either. Like, basically, outside of Virtus Pro, none of the top teams really understood the idea of pacing yourself. But to be fair, I think Virtus Pro was also like the best team of that year. So maybe it was just easier for them to skip out on events, just because they kind of they felt like they had already secured their spot with the DPC points, right? And there were a lot of different reasons as to why I think this system didn't really work out for Dota 2. And basically, there's too many events. The quality of the events weren't up to par all the time. So, for instance, I think like ESL, PGL, and Starlight are all pretty good. I don't think DreamHack got one that year. Some of the Chinese events are pretty sick. DAC, the Super Major, MDL, but like the other ones are kind of iffy, and some of them just didn't make sense. Like Captain's Draft really shouldn't have gotten any points, but it did. Stuff like that, right? Now, why do I, even though Valve abandoned this system for Dota 2, I think it's the perfect system for CSGO, and here's why. Basically, unlike Dota 2, there's no vacuum for tournament organizers to fight for all the space. We already have a pretty filled out schedule for the CSGO system, right? And we already know basically who the best TOs are in general. So you have ECS, ESL, DreamHack, Starladder. Those are like I'd argue those are the four main ones, but I guess Blast is now coming into it. And so with just that, you already have a pretty good basis of just quality events. And not only that, but because unlike Dota 2, like tournament organizers didn't come in and out. So in and out the entire time, like basically CSGO events have been going on and been building a good amount of history for the last few years. And because of that, it's really easy, I think, to pinpoint which events you want to consider majors and which ones you want to consider minors. So for instance, ESL Cologne is an easy major, IM Katowice is an easy major, the DreamHack Master Series, all of them are majors. The bigger Star Ladder events, those are majors. Epicenter, you'd probably put that as a major, right? E-League, you put that as a major or whatever. And then for the DreamHack Opens, and the other one-offs, you'd put those as minors. And what's good about this system I've set up is it will enforce if you just basically transfer the DPC system into the CSGO system, you're not actually creating new tournaments or creating overarching structures that need money. You're just basically implementing a point system where it requires manpower to keep track of where the teams are and making sure that neither teams, nor organizers, nor players are abusing the system in any particular way. That's about it. But outside of that, it does provide a lot of different things because basically we're already running that system just without the points. So we already have a pretty good layout. So all the oversaturation problems, like the burnout problems, the quality problems, all of that is kind of left by the wayside. The only questions you have to ask yourself is if you're trying to implement this DPC system into the CSGO system is the guidelines you want to implement. So for instance, if it was up to me, I'd say if you want to be a major, you need at least 16 teams. One, you need a certain amount of prize money. And unlike Dota 2, I don't think you actually need a high amount of prize money. I think there's a certain level of I think like prize money isn't quite as important, but I just say over 250,000 seems reasonable. Seems because that's always been kind of like the barrier before like CSGO. It seems like CSGO teams don't quite care as much. So 16 teams, prize money, format, and you can I'd argue you either run GSL, the double elimination format that ESL currently runs, or Swiss. I think those are the three main ones you want to run. Outside of that, the last thing you want is regional qualifiers because Valve has always been very specific about making sure everybody has a chance all across the world. And so the way the Dota 2 tournament organizers did this and the way current CSGO organizers do this is exactly within Valve's vision, which is you have like a set amount of invites, usually the top eight teams you can get, and then you have like 8 qualifiers that go towards the event, and that's how you run it, right? So really, if you're just thinking about it, there isn't a lot of extra work anybody has to do in terms of transitioning it over. And so what are the actual benefits? Because now I've explained like it's not hard. It shouldn't be necessarily hard to do. What are the benefits of doing this? Right. Here's the first thing. Basically, it fixes a lot of the problems I have with the major. And what are the biggest problems I have with the major? First off, like the major seeding is kind of crap. What do I mean by that? The major seeding does not take into account anything that happened prior to the major. It only takes into account what happened at the last major. So that's why you always get a few like bum teams. And I want to be very specific about this because I don't want this to be like an important aspect of the argument. But basically, within the current major system, any team that makes top 8 deserves, and I don't mean, I'll just go say like deserves their spot within the structure that Valve has set up. As in, they got top 8, so they get top 8. They get a seed into the next major, right? But that ignores all of the play in between, from one major to the next. With a DPC system, it doesn't matter if you got top 8 in the last major. In order to get a seed into the next major, you have to do well within the DPC system. So top 8 teams in this particular case, top 8 ranked teams by points would get that seed into the major. And this is great for a number of reasons. First, you're going to get the better teams, at least based off of form within the last X amount of months. And better teams generally means better games, which generally means better viewership. Generally means better viewership and all that good stuff that people want to see, right? Secondly, it helps build the major into the rest of the circuit. As the major currently stands, it's kind of like its own exiled thing from the rest of the tournament circuit. Like everything counts as part of your legacy, but it doesn't really feel like the rest of the tournaments are building up towards the major in a tangible sense. Like in an intangible sense, yes, it is. Like teams are slowly peaking towards that major. But if you actually put in the actual points, you can see that teams are actually securing their spot for the major, and that creates a natural and very easy to follow narrative and story arc for all the teams to get toward this major. And we already know this structural system of creating a narrative works. And the reason we know this works is because the IM Grand Slam basically shows why it works. Basically, like if you do a structural system like that, it's a very easy storyline for fans to follow. Or they'll be like, oh, this is the one where if FaZe win, they can win the fucking Grand Slam, and that's why they need to win this one. They'll get that extra $1 million. But if they go to the finals, and they get upset, then the other team gets the bounty or whatever, right? In this case, it's much simpler. Oh, if Astralis win this, Astralis win their second big major event in this year, that basically secures them for the major. They don't have to worry, and then they can go ahead and skip as many events as they want because they've secured the spot for the major or whatever, right? That's kind of how it would work. And then by the time you peak towards the major, you're going to get these really cool storylines where like you have a team, where you have like 3 or 4 different teams fighting for the 7th or 8th slot, and now all of a sudden everybody's interested in these kind of like middling teams. You usually don't draw as much interest as the top teams, but in this case, because they're the ones still fighting for a seed into the major, people are going to want to follow that progress a lot more intensely if you implement the system. So by doing this system, you are now implementing how well a team does into the season, into the major. You are implementing a very strong structure, a structural narrative from the season into the major. And like I said, in terms of cost, it's not as effective. And then the final thing I think you want to look at is the fact that it solves a lot of conflict of interest problems. And what do I mean by that? If we're looking at the CSGO landscape right now, the biggest question we have for Astralis is, why are they only playing at Blast events, and why aren't they going to like the bigger Star Ladder or DreamHack Masters events? And they haven't really given a great sort of answer to that, because I think Thorne basically pointing this out, like, why didn't they just use the same reasoning they did last year, where they were like, well, we have to prepare for tournaments. Well, they did do that last year, but they still went to the bigger events. This year, they've skipped a bunch of the bigger events for the Blast events. Well, in this system, if it was implemented, the Blast events wouldn't be a major or minor because there's only 6 teams. They wouldn't qualify that way. There's no qualifiers for those. And all of a sudden, basically, if Blast wants to like be a legitimate tier 1 competitive league, then they have to at least follow the qualifications of what the other tournaments are doing. And I know that's not within their purview, as in like that's not what they want, but they're in a weird space just as a tournament organizer, just based off of what the CEO said in that weird interview with HLTV, where they're like, they want to be a competitive tournament, but they also want to be a big fan tournament, and those are not necessarily distinct. Those two incentives are not always aligned. And so if Blast is killing it as a fan event, I think it's failing as a competitive event. Right? It's just a smaller event in my view. It's easier to win. Just based off of the amount of wins, it's just in terms of format, I think it's far worse than the other leagues in terms of qualifiers. It's basically non-existent. So there's a lot of reasons as to why I don't think it works. Right? And so by doing it here, by implementing the DPC into CSGO, if the Charlotte decide to still skip these bigger events, then they're basically just punishing themselves. And that's kind of what I think. I don't want to talk for the community, but I think this is a legitimate way of basically what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, it's a way of inhibiting these conflict of interest and franchising problems. In a sense, what I mean by that is, if, for instance, if Blast really wants to like go hardcore on this franchise league and like get a shot to other events, then at the very least they have to match the other tournaments in terms of the size of the tournament. So 16 teams, regional qualifiers, all that and a good format, all that shit, right? At the very least, they'd have to do that. And if they did that, then all the hardcore fans would be far less angry about it. And so it kind of, while it doesn't necessarily solve the conflict of interest problems, it does at least force like a tournament organizer like Blast to kind of up their game in a sense if they want to be considered a tier 1 league. And at the same time, and if they don't do that, then it does incentivize teams to play at bigger LAN events like Star Ladder, like DreamHack, like IEM Sydney. And these are all important events, in my view, just because, they're just better events, straight up. And they're the ones I like. They're the ones I like to watch because of the format, because of all that other stuff, right? So, is there anything else about this DPC thing? All right, last thing I want to point out is how will the rest of it work? What I mean by that is, I've talked about how it kind of transitions over, but how would teams qualify for the major? Because that's something I guess I'll go over here. Basically, in the DPC, after the top 8 teams qualify, right? And by doing this, you're basically getting basically the best 8 teams in the world, and this ensures your competitive component. And then the other 16 teams you want are for the regional component, which is what Valve's always been very strict on. They want everybody across the world to get their chances to play. And in the current system, it's two from each region, so 2 NA, 2 EU, 2 CIS, and 2 Asia. And then the final 2 slots are basically the 2 third play-in slots at the minor, or not the minor, but the challenger stage, right? With this system, basically you have 6 extra slots you can allocate, and you can do one of two things. You can either allocate them based off of DPC performance, and what I mean by that is, the 2017-2018 DPC I was talking about, a lot of the middling teams are in NA, and because of that, and like right below the cutoff were in NA, and because of that, the DPC decided, or not DPC, but like Valve decided they were going to give more slots to NA, and then NA got more qualifier slots into TI. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is you could just either add more playing slots or just add or do like a compromise. Be like, well, NA and EU generally have the better teams, so just give them one extra one, and then you do the rest towards like the more playing slots or whatever. So it's not that, I don't think it's that complicated to figure out the compromise. Last thing I'll talk about is the most complicated part to talk about is the way the points are allocated as to whether they should be player-based or org-based. For now, I'm leaning towards orgs. And the reason for that is generally speaking, in CSGO, buyouts are so big that it doesn't make a lot of sense for an org to like here's basically here's the problem basically with the old DPC system was they kind of just locked out players in a weird way where I'm really losing my train of thought here. All right, well basically there was a lot of weird, funny ways you can mess around with the points and the system in the old DPC, and the obvious one was Lil joined Navi, and the reason this was a problem was basically in DPC 2017-2018 points are allocated to players, and the assumption was like you wouldn't really want to kick a player because he has all those points. I think that was the initial assumption. In reality, if you had a shit ton of points like Virtus Pro did, and you thought you could get a better player, which they did, Roger for Lil, then it was completely fine to kick Lil. But the problem with kicking Lil was that a really bad team like Navi could just pick up Lil, and all of a sudden they jump way far ahead of every other team that was in that conversation. And that's why when you're allocating points, I think it makes a lot more sense to use the 2018 and 2019 rules where you allocate it to the orgs, where basically what happens in that case is like if the team wins, like a team gets first and they get like, I don't know, 600 DPC points or whatever, then the org gets that, right? And then if the org changes players, the players stay with the points stay with the org. So there's really no like fuckery in terms of swapping players for DPC points in order to qualify for the major and get in that way. So those are my general thoughts. I think it works out just because the buyouts are insane, so you can't really play around with the shuffle deck if you're an org trying to get in. Like I don't think the math works out that way. I could be wrong. Obviously not part of any team organization, so perhaps that's something somebody will have to look into. But I think just overall, the DPC is the DPC implementation into CSGO would be a positive change. It would be a low cost change, and I really don't see I've gone through a few negatives, but I really don't see it being that influential overall. And so because of that, I just think it's a good thing to implement. All right, see you guys later.